All right, part 6 of Rousseau's Social Contract. This time we are looking at Book 2, Chapter 6, Law, and Chapter 7, The Legislator. And unfortunately, I was hoping we were going to get some more details here, but the end result is not particularly great, and well, I'll show you why. Chapter 6 starts with the declaration that effectively the social compact is what gives the body politic existence in life, and legislation is what gives it movement and will. And so this invisible, phantasmal thing that I've been complaining about the whole time, now it has movement and will, at least in Rousseau's perception. Of course, as we know, only people are going to actually be able to claim, to have the gist of what the general will is. We can never measure it independently of what individual people actually say. Now, Rousseau does something a little unexpected here. He goes back to almost a Richard Hooker style conception of justice. All justice comes from God, but we have no access to it. Okay, that's an acceptable. That's an actual problem, right? It may be that assuming that there is a God, right? Assuming that there is some ultimate arbiter of good and evil, right? It may be that we have no direct access to those judgments, and that what we think is good and what we think is evil has nothing to do with what God does. He also talks about natural rights. He says natural rights may exist in reason, right? In the same way that mathematical concepts exist, in a sense, right? But unfortunately, these natural rights, the reason behind them can't force the wicked from acting wickedly. Therefore, conventions and laws are needed to, quote, join rights to duties and refer justice to its object, end quote. Now, this is actually a somewhat decent point. Natural law is not self-enforcing, just like written constitutions aren't self-enforcing, right? So even voluntary contracts are not self-enforcing. Typically, the parties to such a contract agree to some arbitrator before they sign the contract. Rousseau is wrong that the overpowering force of a totalitarian state is necessary for the mitigation of all conflicts. In fact, the assignment of power to people without the consent of the governed is, in my opinion, a more dangerous alternative and has a tendency to create sympathetic rebels. And also a need for massive amounts of propaganda. Joining rights to duties is a common political slogan, but it doesn't really solve the problem if those combinations aren't fully accepted by the people to whom they apply, and if those combinations are chosen, say, arbitrarily in order to favor certain groups at the expense of others, right? When you agree to a contract, it does come with rights and responsibilities, but you agree to both of those, and you agree to the fact that those two things are connected to each other, right? If you don't do your responsibility, then you can't really complain that much if the arbitrator says, well, the other guy isn't, then the things that are your rights within the contract are also void. Rousseau continues, under the state of nature, quote, I owe nothing to him whom I have promised nothing. I recognize as belonging to others only what is of no use to me, end quote. Now here Rousseau is half right. The first half is good. I owe nothing to him whom I have promised nothing. But the second half is an overstatement, because if it were true, then there wouldn't ever be any temporary peace between neighbors. It wouldn't be possible. In fact, it is possible, saying I own nothing is a different category from I recognize as, right? Because I owe nothing is something that is held like in my own mind, but also in the mind of someone else. Whereas I recognize as is something that's only in my mind. I am perfectly at liberty to recognize other people's homesteaded goods as belonging to them. There's nothing preventing me from recognizing that, as opposed to something where I have agreed, I owe you this, and the other person's like, you owe me this, and we're like, yes, and we both agree. Now, the precise form of property rights is up to neighboring individuals, of course, right? This is not something that we can, declare from on high. We just think that, like, homesteading is a good example of how this kind of sort of an example that works well in common practice. And of course, any particular sense of property rights that we might agree between you and I without agreeing to form a state between us is always vulnerable to encroachment from outsiders who aren't part of this agreement. Or, if you agree with someone who is, agreeing in bad faith and intends to try to steal, they might try to violate property rights while trying to keep up appearances. These are both things that can happen and we need to think about. Now, in a natural law society or a voluntary society, the people would get to choose how vigorously to defend their property from outsiders and thieves, as they are free to dedicate as much or as little of what they have to that goal, right? If there's a group of people that are in a voluntary society together and someone comes in and starts punching people, well, they might decide off with his head, and there's not really anyone, assuming that this guy isn't supported by another large group of people with some other agreement with them that's already there, then, it might be like, well, off with your head. You came in and started slugging people, and that's what our agreement says with each other. There might be things like extradition treaties where it's like, hey, he came in slugging people, but he belongs to this group, so it is our job to give him back to this group and let them deal with him, kind of thing. These are all things that can happen. There's no reason for us to believe that only one type of society can and will exist for extended periods of time. I mean, the worst Stalinist communism kind of nonsense lived for decades before it eventually collapsed, and part of why it collapsed was because of constant conflict with the West. The bad ideas in societies can last a lot longer than an individual generation can last, and that's something that we need to always keep our minds on when we talk about, like, this solves this problem right now, yes, but what does it do 3 generations down the road? Can we even predict what it does? Maybe not. Now, Rousseau's system, by comparison to the voluntary system I was just talking about, where it's like, oh yeah, you came in and started slugging people, off with your head. Or, hey, you joined the group in bad faith and you started stealing stuff, off with your head. Or it could be, yeah, we're gonna, put you in stocks for a couple of days. Or, right hand gets chopped off. I don't know. It could be any of those things. In a natural law society or voluntary society, all of these things are options. Rousseau's system, by his own admission in the last part that we just studied, aims at the end of protecting property while claiming the ability to expropriate whatever means it deems necessary. This is much more susceptible to internal corruption, right? If we say our goal is to... It's like 100% solving all crimes, right? Everything from... the squatters in a house to a stolen car to a pack of gum that was stolen. All of these things have costs to enforcement, right? You have to be able to investigate. You have to be able to prove that this person was the culprit, etc. Societies may decide to limit the amount of effort that they put into certain things, and we can argue that certain limits are better than other limits that someone might choose. But the problem with Rousseau's framework is that his laws are by definition general. So it's like theft shall be punished might be a general law. Well, and then it says we can also take everything that we need to punish theft, which is susceptible to people saying, well, I need just a little bit more, and we're going to get this next, marginal category of crime. And then they say, oh, we just need a little bit more to get this next marginal category of crime. You end up spending a lot on things that people don't actually care about that much, right? You might find that the marginal cost to finding the guy who stole the pack of gum is worth more than the pack of gum. And so a better solution would be just to, give restitution to the person from whom the gum was stolen, or something like that. There's plenty of options. Rousseau is pigeonholing his society into basically one or a few of these. He continues, the law consists of, quote, when the whole people decrees for the whole people, end quote. It, quote, considers subjects en masse and actions in the abstract, end quote. Anything that aims at the particular is not a law, but a decree. Now, this is kind of a peculiar definition of law, but Rousseau is repeating it here. And the problem with this definition of law is that in order for it to ever be used, it must be converted into decree. There's no way to take law and apply it to person. Every application of law is a decree. And so this line between them doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Insofar as he's trying to say that all legitimate laws are general, that can be accomplished in other systems if desirable, and he hasn't even necessarily proven that it is desirable. In fact, he goes on. Quote, this isn't a quote, but it's paraphrase. The law may set up a class structure or a hereditary monarchy, but it does not and cannot say who is in what class or which family shall be the line of kings. This seems to be Rousseau's source for distinguishing between bad and good governments, despite the fact that different peoples demand different structures in the particulars. Rousseau's differentiation between good and bad seems to be mostly a product of his own preferences, and no, clear logical argument. Then he does something really stupid. Quote, and I'm going to quote it because it's that stupid. I therefore give the name republic to every state that is governed by laws, no matter what the form of its administration may be. End quote. And then he goes on to say that only republics are legitimate. Now, he has a footnote that says that, yeah, monarchies can be republics by this definition, and so on and so forth, but, like, this is kind of dumb. He's using a word that I think he's using because he wants to sound more like Plato. We'll get more of that a little bit later on, but he seems to be like saying, "Oh, we need to call the government a republic, or else it's not good," because that's what Plato called his good government. In fact, Locke used the term commonwealth because it's actually a better word for what Rousseau's describing here. Pulling the existing word republic that has a pre-existing definition into use this way is inaccurate and seems to me to be simple Plato worship. It doesn't really have any place in a theory of political structure. You make up a word, or you come up with a portmanteau or something, because just saying the word republic, and then twisting its definition into something that none of his contemporaries would recognize as a republic, is not the way to do this. He goes on. Laws are, quote, the conditions of civil association, end quote, and ought to be written by the people. However, what gives law writers, quote, the foresight to formulate and announce its acts in advance, end quote. Another quote, how can a blind multitude which often does not know what it wills, because it so rarely knows what is good for it, carry out for itself so great and difficult an enterprise as a system of legislation, end quote. This is why a legislator is needed, so posits Rousseau. Obviously a legislator is needed, right, or legislators, but the question is what incentives exist for a legislator based on the rules of a system that already exist. How are good legislators to be found? How do you mitigate the self-serving tendencies of being a legislator, etc.? He doesn't really answer any of these questions right now, and he's not going to do it that well in the next chapter either, as we're going to see. This is basically chapter 6. He restates his peculiar definition of law. He makes some overstatements about the state of nature that are just not true. He makes a good point about, natural law and reason and stuff like that not being self-enforcing, but he's basically arguing that we have to go a lot further than you actually need to go in order to enforce those, laws, whatever, your society or your group of people decides they happen to be. It's also worth noting that one of the goals or one of the values of a self-consistent moral system is that once you explain it to someone, they can violate it, but they can't say that it's not self-consistent. And therefore, the self-consistent system as a system for designing or determining justice is outside the hands of the individuals to some degree. That's what gives people who follow such a system kind of like a justification for defending against people that break the rules of that self-consistent system. Which isn't to say that there aren't possibly more than one self-consistent system to think about, examine, look into, but the standard kind of voluntarist one is the one I'm most interested in. Anyway, this finishes chapter 6, the law. Next up, we will be talking about the legislator specifically. Chapter 7, the legislator. Rousseau says that the ideal legislator has the ability to see and judge the passions of men, but does not experience those passions. He must be concerned primarily with the happiness of others, that is to say the people, and must be far-sighted. These are all kind of well and good qualifications, but once again Rousseau is neglecting the idea of looking at man as he is. He's getting utopian here in the worst possible sense. He's wandering off into idealism and creating a mold for a legislator that no man can fill. This is one of the problems when your system has no checks and balances, but still has lots and lots of power. You kind of need angels to dance on the head of that pin you've created, so that the thing doesn't topple over. He then mentions that the legislator is like the inventor, and contrasts that with the prince as a mechanic. This is the classic legislative-executive boundary, which he said earlier we shouldn't separate states into multiple parts, but going ahead with this is all well and good, but it kind of ignores the possibility and incentives for legislators and executives to kind of team up and get fat at everybody else's expense. Rousseau goes on, quote, "He who dares to undertake the making of a people's institutions out, to feel himself capable, so to speak, of changing human nature, of transforming each individual who is by himself a complete and solitary whole into part of a greater whole, from which he in a manner receives his life and being, of altering man's constitution for the purpose of strengthening it, and of substituting a partial and moral existence for the physical and independent existence nature has conferred on us all. One thing I'm noticing in these chapters as we go on is that he's getting more and more wordy as he goes on, because he's kind of wiggling. He's trying to find like these long, wordy, like social sounding, theoretical sounding paragraphs, so that he can kind of put out this word salad that doesn't mean a whole lot, but he can kind of twist it into something that he can kind of make arguments from. Basically, I've noticed a lot of it in these last two chapters, especially. There were a couple of paragraphs in these chapters that I just said, this doesn't say anything, and I moved on. But let's actually try to take this particular paragraph, which is pretty bloated on its own, and take a look at it. There's this creepy transformative nature of Rousseau's ideal government here. It makes everybody into a drone at the mercy of the few who actually hold the power. There's this transforming each individual into part of a greater whole. There's substituting a partial and moral existence for physical and independent existence. And there's a lot of mumbo-jumbo here about making people into part of the collection, but there isn't actually any real physical mechanic for doing this. It's all propaganda. It's all lies that the government tells you in order to make you support it. In fact, in the next paragraph, Rousseau continues, quote, "Take away from man his own resources and give him instead new ones, incapable of being made use of without the help of other men. If each citizen is nothing and can do nothing without the rest, and the resources acquired by the whole are equal or superior to the aggregate of the resources of all the individuals, it may be said that legislation is at the highest possible point of perfection." So basically, now Rousseau wants the state to materially overwhelm all of the citizens. There will be lots of public property, which means lots of bureaucracy and lots of public spending, lots of opportunities for grift. It is a recipe for dependency and eventual tyranny, as the people have no right and also no means by which to leave a bad state. This is similar to the problem that I mentioned when Kropotkin was talking about, people entering and leaving communes, right? Well, the commune owns all the stuff. If the commune decides you're not pulling your weight, it can kick you out. And it doesn't kick you out with stuff that you earned that is your property. It kicks you out naked, right? This is the problem. This is much worse than what capitalism does, where if a businessman fires you, well, you still get all of the money that he paid you up until that moment. You still have all of your property. You still have the clothes on your back and the tools that you may have purchased. You still have all of your own institutional knowledge, things like that. Kropotkin would strip all of those things from you, and Rousseau is kind of moving along the same direction. He basically says, expand public property to the point where no individual or no group of individuals, to include everybody, can possibly fight against the force and power and wealth and largesse that the state possesses. Well, who's the state? Well, it's everybody minus a couple of people, and that's the problem. Quote, "He who holds command over men ought not to have command over the laws, and he who has command over the laws ought not any more to have it over men, or else his laws would be the ministers of his passions, and would often merely serve to perpetuate his injustices." End quote. This is a hint of separation of powers, and it's the first hint that we get. And these are surprisingly a bit more significant at their base level, and therefore less general than Locke's conception, where Locke said there was a whole bunch of different possible ways to split powers up to and including having a king, but the king still sees himself as a servant of the people. Rousseau just basically said that monarchies can be called what he calls republics, but this seems to oppose that possibility. If there is a monarch who has both executive and legislative power, then that's something that goes against Rousseau's perception of what a state ought to be here. So why is he kind of double dipping here? Is it because he just wants to not, necessarily piss off every single monarch that there is? Maybe. But it's not very good reasoning. It's pretty muddled and foggy-headed, honestly. He then gives this callback to historical examples. He talks about Lycurgus abdicating his throne before creating laws. He talks about how Greek towns, republics of Italy, and Geneva hired foreigners to write their laws, and how decemvirs could write the laws but not pass them. He then says that laws should be passed by quote, the free vote of the people, end quote. Once again, direct democracy rears its ugly head with all the negatives it can produce. There are no inherent limits on state action or state power, and there's the possibility, not just the possibility, but the incentive for the basically the enslavement of and exploitation of small groups. Plus, it's just kind of might makes right by proxy, which is ideally what we should be trying to get away from. If something is just might makes right with extra steps, then it's not really principally any better at the end than just a king telling you what to do. All that Rousseau is doing here is using number as a substitute for force of arms as a proxy, which, as we've seen, is doesn't particularly improve the situation in a principled way. It might, for short periods of time, make things practically better, but from a principled perspective, it definitely results in just the same kind of oppression. Next. Wise men often misunderstood or fail to keep the attention of the masses. Legislators, quote, must have recourse to an authority of a different order, capable of constraining without violence and persuading without convincing, end quote. This is the reason for many national leaders to, quote, credit the gods with their own wisdom in order that the peoples might obey freely and bear with docility the yoke of the public happiness, end quote. Yes, many states have been built upon myths. That this particular family is the one that has been ordained by God to rule. This says very little about their actual structures, except that the leaders believed they needed to push the masses with fear and intimidation rather than achieve actual consent and limit themselves to voluntary association. People who want to hold power often do this. It's kind of part of what wanting to hold power entails. Fraud, which is what this is, right? Lying to someone in order to get them to agree to a contract that puts them at a disadvantage. This is not a good way to start any long-term relationship. And, the long-term incentives of such a structure are that the government consistently grows, it consistently grabs just a little bit more power until it has all the power that it needs and can completely, expropriate, if not enslave, all the people that it claims to serve. Rousseau makes two more points in this chapter. First one. False legislators may fake this miracle, but their empires will be bands of fools and not last, which implies that this initial fraud is necessary to the start of a state in order to fake consent. It also implies that, a band of fools that lasts for 70 years is of no consequence to the people that had to live under it, right? This is one of those things where there's no distinction between the band of fools and the actual good legislators as far as Rousseau goes. The general will is infallible, right? And we can't actually tell what the general will says, so we just have to believe what the government, functionaries say that it says. Plus, you can ruin 3 generations of people by having a band of fools that lasts just 75 years. This is not a solution to anything, and in fact, it creates incentives, as I've been showing, that result, or at least push in the direction of things getting worse and worse as time goes on. And there's nothing that the people can do about it because they're left in a state of, poverty and dependency. The final quote of the chapter, quote, we should not, with Warburton, conclude from this that politics and religion have among us a common object, but that in the first periods of nations, the one is used as an instrument for the other. This is, of course, the state co-opting religious values and doctrine for its own aggrandizement, which is very Plato-like, but also not very good, as far as we, believe, as far as we can gather. It basically leads to states that defraud and impoverish the people that they're supposed to be serving, and then call it service, and then propagandize them into believing that it's service. It's not a solution that is any better than, being a slave that's being whipped, at least not in the long run. So that completes chapters 6 and 7 of book 2 of Rousseau's Social Contract. Next up is the people, and this part actually has multiple. For some reason, he decided to split this topic into multiple chapters. So probably we'll be covering the people in one big part, hopefully. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. Rousseau Part 6, Book 2, Chapters 6 and 7. Ideas of law that inevitably are troubling because they are so fraught with bad incentives. turning the people into a dependent mass under the state is part of Rousseau's framework, and using fraud to start things up is also part of Rousseau's framework, or at least acceptable. And all of these things are not consent, right? This is what people who are trying to think about voluntary societies are trying to avoid, is the idea that, like, hey, God says you should be part of my government, or you should be a citizen in my government. Well, I mean, if you can't prove that, then you're basically just defrauding me in order to grab tax money, or take my land, or take my stuff, or take my labor, or whatever. These are all things that make it easier for the state to exploit people, as opposed to things that make it less easy for the state to exploit people, among much of which would be consent. Informed consent would be a good way to get rid of, or at least minimize, state exploitation of people by force. Or any exploitation by force, right? Because if you consent, then you don't need the force. That's kind of the point. We also see him kind of worshipping Plato a little bit in his structure of how religion is supposed to work, and in the use of the word republic when commonwealth does exist. We see him making some good points about the state of nature not being self-enforcing, but not offering a particularly good alternative. Yeah, I mean, we see a strange definition of law that differentiates between law and decree, but no law can ever apply to someone without becoming a decree. And so what's the difference? It's kind of silly. But there it is, and we're just going to keep going. So I will pick up the next couple of chapters in the next week. Maybe I'll have some other video stuff this week for you. But until then, have a good week, and I will see you next time.